I don't normally go after individual writers or columnists for specific articles or columns they've written, and when I do, it's nearly always some dumb woke leftist like a Taylor Lorenz or a Charles Blow, people who, in other words, only ever write things that are astoundingly stupid and intellectually indefensible. But John Nolte at Breitbart News, a guy whose work I'd say I normally enjoy, probably more than half the time, at any rate, he put out a column earlier today that might be the honest-to-God stupidest thing I have ever read from a conservative writer for a conservative publication. And the background is this. Bernie Marino, the Senate candidate from Ohio, endorsed by Donald Trump, just won the primary election by a fairly healthy margin. So you know what happens next, because you've seen this movie before. The mainstream fake news media are going to get all hands on deck to wage a campaign of scorched earth personal destruction on this guy for committing the unpardonable sin of being a Trump-endorsed candidate who has a chance to take a Senate seat away from the Democrats. In this case, they didn't even wait for him to win the primary. A couple weeks ago, they actually tried to stitch him up for supposedly making a profile on Adult Friend Finder like 15 or 16 years ago, and their evidence was some secondhand remark that some anonymous host says they heard at a party back in 2012 or some shit like that. And how squeaky clean must this dude be if that is all they could come up with for a scandal? So that feeble attempt failed to move the needle at all. He won the election by just as much as he would have won it by anyway, so it seems like a dead end that they're going to be able to churn up some sort of Bernie Marino sex scandal. So what's left? What are we supposed to do now? Well, the New York Times decides, hey, we've got to give this thing the good old college try. We can't all go to our graves knowing there was a Republican candidate that we didn't try to destroy. So the Times editorial page ran a column the other day about how Bernie Marino is white. And because they're the New York Times and they are playing to an audience of disgusting racist shitbags, they use the word white as a pejorative, and they use it repeatedly that way. If you're in Ohio, you can't vote for this guy because he is a filthy white peckerwood cracker, and that was the thrust of the column. So now, enter John Nolte at Breitbart. The headline of this column today goes like this. NYT political reporter, quote unquote, spreads disinformation that Bernie Moreno is white, also quote unquote. And here, Mr. Nolte lays out his thesis. Quote, Jonathan Weissman, a political reporter at the far-left New York Times, attempted to spread disinformation about Republican U.S. Senate candidate Bernie Moreno being white, unquote. And he goes on to say, quote, Moreno is not white. He's Colombian. He's so Colombian, in fact, he was born in Bogota, Colombia, unquote. Now, first of all, he spelled Colombian wrong with a U instead of an O, so he's not exactly with crowning himself in glory right off the bat here. And what is the biggest problem with Mr. Nolte's thesis? Well, the fact that Colombia is a majority white country, just like a variety of Central and South American countries are. White Europeans are an absolute majority of the population in Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Cuba, Uruguay, which is the whitest country in the Americas, by the way, including Canada, Ecuador, and Bolivia. And no, before you ask, that does not include mestizos or mulattoes. That is just people who self-identify as being only white European. In fact, there are exactly as many white Latin Americans as there are white people in the United States, around 200 million each. Now, John Nolte is obviously operating under the mistaken impression, and it's an impression that a shockingly regrettable number of Americans share, that everybody south of the Mexican border from Tijuana all the way to Tierra del Fuego is part of some homogeneous racial monolith called Latino, apparently only by virtue of the fact that they speak Spanish and Portuguese, which is a weird basis since those are both white European languages. The idea that Latino is a separate and distinct race is something that's been pushed very heavily by the American left these last 15 or 20 years, and the reasons for that are fairly obvious. The whole Democrat Party electoral strategy is to separate the population into as many racial and ethnic subgroups as possible, then pit the groups against each other and use them to mix and match an electoral coalition every 4 years. Bob's your uncle. We win. In other words, here we have a conservative columnist on a conservative news site writing a column that premises and predicates itself on the uncritical acceptance of woke leftist racial paradigm. The proper response to the New York Times smearing Bernie Moreno as a white guy is not to deny and refute his whiteness. The proper response is to say, who gives a shit? And how is it that people on the right, even when all of the facts are on their side, still manage to find new and inventive ways of putting the ball in their own net and losing to the damn wokesters? Stuff like this is how. Hit the music, Jim Eagle.